Good evening and welcome. I'm so glad to see so many of you here tonight, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of the series Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts. My name is Bonnie Efros, and I'm the Rothman Chair and Director of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere here at the University of Florida. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the University of Florida Faculty Senate President and Professor of English, Scott Nygren, who has kindly agreed to join us this evening in opening the series.
Thank you, Bonnie. One of the institutions that makes me proudest to be at the University of Florida is the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere. I was able to be here when Bonnie first came and to help support the formation of the center. I think it's a great institution. I'm really looking forward to this series. I just want to say a few words about the central framework about this whole idea of what we're doing in this series and what the center is trying to do. There are a number of misconceptions about the humanities, the idea that the humanities is simply in decline, for example, or something like this. And the analogy I like to use is with the New York Times. The New York Times, if anybody's been following this, you may know that the readership for the New York Times has increased dramatically recently, primarily because of the internet, but its advertising revenue is going down because all the advertisers are putting their money on Google rather than on the print copies anymore. To my mind, this is very strongly analogous to the situation in the humanities because the need for the humanities has never been greater. Our interest in trying to train people and to learn how to deal with the world at large has never been more important. But at the same time, state funding for the humanities, which is the way public universities have been supported until now, has been in decline. So we need a new way of thinking about the role of the humanities and the role that it plays, precisely because it's so important. I also wanted to mention that it's not only in the humanities that the humanities are important. This is not simply an isolated picture. I just came from the law reform presentation early this morning with Sandra Day O'Connor, and the discussion there is about the law reform being needed because the courts are in crisis. State legislatures are also trying to defund court systems, so it's impossible to carry on the judicial branch of this country. Legislatures now refer to the judicial system rather than it being a third branch of government. They now see it as an agency that just takes more money. Not quite constitutional, but that's the problem they're trying to deal with. I think of my colleague Jack Milkowski in the engineering college, who once had a nice way of saying it, I think, that he says the first thing we need to teach students is that there are questions to which there is no single correct answer. Okay, that's a humanities question, right? But it's being taught in engineering. In dentistry, I have a colleague friend there who's very concerned that all they have time to do now is to give multiple choice exams. And what he really wants to do is to be able to give some kind of at least short answer, a longer question to find out what the students are actually thinking, because he's very much aware that short answers are far more informative, or at least something in language, that a multiple choice can tell you something that people have memorized for the short term, but it doesn't indicate lasting knowledge. Okay? So in this sense, I think we have friends. Humanities has friends all across the university, but I think most importantly, we need to address the public at large, because the conversation needs to be larger than just our specialization. It needs to be larger than the university. The entire constituency and the public, the state of Florida, need to understand why humanities are important. So I encourage everyone to speak out more and to talk more too in a public context, because if we don't, who will explain why the humanities are important? Okay? And that is in the context, precisely the context in which the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere was founded. I like to think the short idea here is humanities at large. Humanities is part of the world. It's not isolated from it. So thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to this series. And let me turn it back now to Bonnie for our speaker.
In the last several years, we've seen in the United States unprecedented assaults on higher education, in the course of which state universities have taken a particularly heavy hit. The much contested closure of the departments of French, Italian, classics, Russian, and theater at SUNY Albany caused shockwaves among academics who assumed that these basic underpinnings of the historic liberal arts education would never be threatened. However, shrouded by the excuse of economic necessity in the current recession, cutbacks in the humanities have wider implications. Opposition from skeptics of the humanities questions the very value of a liberal arts education, the contents and goals of humanistic inquiry, and the place of university museums and collections in academic research and curriculum. In making these attacks on the meaningful contributions of universities to American public life, critics have downplayed the traditional role of the humanities scholars in interpreting, adapting to, and in some instances, affecting social change. Yet thinking about the nuances and implications of situations like this is, of course, what humanist scholars do best. Humanist knowledge and experience have become particularly important in the shifting educational landscape caused by diminished resources and universities' consequent reliance on private fundraising and entrepreneurship. Even in this difficult environment, scholars in the humanistic disciplines have continued courageously to address the ethical implications of commercial intervention in academic inquiry and have queried the intellectual responsibilities of higher education, especially in light of the increasing diversity of the student body and internationalization of the curriculum at many universities. The contributions of the humanities disciplines demonstrate that a critical assessment of current and future dilemmas facing universities, aided by the lessons learned from past encounters, will help institutions of higher learning and their faculties and students better weather this time of radical metamorphosis. The thoughts prompted by recent events have formed the backdrop of the 18-month-long series organized by the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere. Our aim is to create a forum with many voices in which we as faculty, students, staff, and community members tackle some of the historical and contemporary tensions in the intellectual life of universities and point to the way their relationships with the surrounding communities, from local to global, might develop and change in the future. Invited speakers will address from a variety of disciplinary perspectives in the humanities, critical issues raised by ethnic and religious difference, cultural change and globalization, and the introduction of market forces into the halls of higher learning. Some of the topics to be addressed will include racial and ethnic integration, the place of women at institutions of higher education, global aspects of the university's resources and outreach, including through its museum collections, and the role of language, religion, and art in a secular university setting. The ultimate goal of the series will be to provide a critical reading of universities' contributions to academic advances and public life so that we can make sense of the complex issues that are integral to their future evolution. Our speakers will contemplate and contextualize the hallmarks, aims, artifacts, audience, and outcomes of a liberal arts education. I want to just take a moment now to acknowledge the sponsorship that's made this series possible. Besides the Rothman Endowment at the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere, our co-sponsors have been extremely generous. These include the Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History Program, the UF Honors Program, the Alexander Grass Chair in Jewish History at UF, the UF International Center, the UF Office of Research, the UF College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the UF Center for Jewish Studies, the UF Libraries, the UF College of Public Health and Health Professions, the UF France-Florida Research Institute, the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Endowment for Florida Archaeology, the UF Department of History, the UF African American Studies Program, the UF Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, the UF College of Design, Construction, and Planning, and the Alachua County Library District. I also want to thank greatly, because this series wouldn't have been possible without them, Sophia Akerd, Cindy Link, and Chris Benora, who helped prepare for this lecture and the 11 that will follow in the coming year and a half. We've also placed information on your seats about the future events in the series, as well as a sign-up sheet if you'd like to get on our mailing list. And we also invite you to join us for a reception in honor of Cary Nelson's lecture directly following his talk in the lobby just outdoors. Finally, after long months of thinking and organizing, it's extremely rewarding and a wonderful relief to see events like tonight's come to fruition. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce you to Professor Cary Nelson. Although in the short period I have, I can't do justice to his impressive resume, since otherwise he'll have no time to speak. I'll do my best to give you some of the highlights. Professor Nelson received his PhD from the University of Rochester, and since 1970 has taught modern poetry and literary theory at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he is Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Professor of English. In the 1970s, he was active in the effort to unionize the Champaign-Urbana faculty and in the drive to recognize a graduate employee union 20 years later. For the last 10 years, he has served on the National Council of the American Association of University Professors, and in 2006, he took office as the AUP's president, being reelected for a second term in 2008. He co-authored the association's Red Book statements on graduate students and on academic professionals. His 25 authored or edited books include, and I'll just list a few, The Incarnate Word, Literature as Verbal Space, Our Last First Poets, Vision and History in Contemporary American Poetry, Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture, Cultural Studies, Higher Education Under Fire, Politics, Economics, and the Crisis of the Humanities, Will Work for Food, Academic Labor in Crisis, Academic Keywords, A Devil's Dictionary for Higher Education, Revolutionary Memory, Recovering the Poetry of the American Left, Office Hours, Activism and Change in the Academy, and most recently, No University is an Island, Saving Academic Freedom. He's also the author of over 100 essays, including many on university governance, and these are published in Academe, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Inside Higher Education. So it's my great honor then to introduce Professor Nelson this evening, and I hope that you'll join me in welcoming him warmly for his lecture on Something Wicked This Way Comes, How to Save the University.
Thank you. I'm here to introduce Sandra Day O'Connor and welcome her to campus. Whoops, wrong notes. Well, I'm here to celebrate the Humanities Library of the Future, the books that we still value. You see spread out before you. More seriously, I am proud to be here at a moment when union membership has increased dramatically. The last time I was in Florida was in Tallahassee last year, and they had a faculty union at about 23%, and they didn't really think they had anywhere to go. But you know, they're in the mid 40% now, and I think that with multiple kindnesses expected from the state legislature in the coming months, 50% will be met and surpassed, 60% will be met. There simply is no other way to survive what's coming without collective action, without the ability to stand together, without solidarity across all campus groups. There is no future for public higher education without unionization. I urge those of you who are not members, faculty members who are not yet members of the union, to join before you leave this room. In fact, you will not be allowed to leave unless you join. There really is nothing better that you can do in difficult times but feel that there are people standing to the left and the right of you and standing with you for the values that you count upon. So I open with that. And then a quote from the New Yorker in January 2010 from an article called Protest Studies that was a reflection on the dramatic protests in California, especially Santa Cruz and California in 2009, which were, at least for the United States, some of the more dramatic group actions that we've seen in a long time. There are other countries where the higher education protests, including in states, I guess, Puerto Rico. They had, same year, they had higher education protests that were met with policemen on horseback and billy clubs, so they had an easy time in Berkeley. In any case, the quote, "Privatization can turn a university into a glorified trade school. Business programs and computer science departments will attract wealthy supporters. But who will bankroll poetry?" I'd like to begin tonight by drawing some contrasts between the sciences and the humanities as they are practiced now. These aren't contrasts that would hold for the whole of human history, but contrasts as these aggregate groups of disciplines confront the contemporary political landscape. And then I'll move on to some of the special challenges that humanities disciplines face. I think it's fair to say that we commonly take it for granted that scientific knowledge must advance, that there is much we do not know, much that we live out our lives without knowing. Although I don't think the public could quantify it, the estimate is that medical knowledge increases, doubles every 5 years. I don't think the public is aware that humanities knowledge also increases exponentially over time. In any case, in terms of the sciences, knowledge of the physical universe beyond the solar system and the galaxy remains so limited that it's hard even to evaluate its partiality. It's hard to grasp, except phantasmatically, what we do not know. The nature of life elsewhere in the universe, a question that could completely shatter all our conceptions of ourselves, remains beyond our grasp. At the other end of the spectrum, as does knowledge of the human body that would enable us to control many major diseases. So we don't know really what's out there, and we don't really know what's in here. And I think to a significant degree that is understood. And yet, I think all of us, members of many human cultures, often unreflectively, uncritically, and in what is a learned form of self-deception, imagine that we largely know ourselves and our history. Being part of human culture means collectively taking on the burden of such illusions, training one another through institutions and social and interpersonal practices to see ourselves and our history falsely. We learn to do that. It's the task of the humanities, ideally, not only to show us when artists and others have penetrated our illusions and created, whether modestly or grandly, but also to try to discover when human cultures have actually seen through a glass darkly. In so doing, of course, we encounter resistance, arguably both angry and dismissive, perhaps more fundamental and intransigent than some current opposition to paradigm shifts in the sciences. To accept that the physical universe is something different from what we have thought is intermittently difficult, most so perhaps when new knowledge contradicts religious conviction or other deeply felt beliefs. And then, indeed, such differences can be dangerous and even fatal. The demand that we see ourselves differently, the assertion that knowledge of ourselves and of our history is fundamentally false, which is part of the continuous burden of the humanities, is, on the other hand, almost always unwelcome, not intermittently unwelcome. The humanities is inherently a project of both learning and unlearning, of celebrating old and new achievements while working to divest ourselves of error and blindness. As I like to argue, it's not only as a result the present that is inherently unstable, but also the past that is unstable. It keeps changing. Forgotten documents and artistic achievements are recovered. Cultural practices are reassessed. The humanities are devoted not only to preserving the monuments of the past, but also to navigating the shifting terrain of all historical knowledge. Now, from paleontology to evolutionary biology to climate science to medicine, as it obviously once was with astronomy, science continues to be the enemy of certain people's belief systems. Despite that, there really is no longer any broad, popularly or politically accepted model of science remaining universally static, of science that does not evolve, that simply transmits the best that has been thought and said, let alone of a science that never questions whether its factual conclusions or its evaluative judgments are sound. There's no model of science any longer, there was once, that would operate that way. Yet the humanities has myriad advocates at universities, among conservative organizations and columnists, and certainly among politicians, of a heritage preserved in amber, of disciplines largely frozen in time. Science today perhaps mostly fights battles against specific convictions, and those battles can have a real cost, to be sure, given that animal experimentation, sex research, and other targeted areas have been compromised when universities caved in to populist offensives, which they still will. And, of course, given that such specializations as climate science can face powerful political opposition. But these remain conceptually, ideologically local struggles, arguments against particular bodies of thought and disciplines and subdisciplines. The humanities is potentially comprehensively at odds with what people fundamentally believe they are, thus also with what comprehensive ends education and culture should serve. If scientists, however, often avoid more fundamental cultural challenges, humanists, one should note, often credit themselves with upsetting the existing order when they are actually doing something far less fundamental. I offer all these comparisons with some awareness that counterexamples can be found, while recognizing at the same time that the different kinds of existing challenges to sciences and the humanities in the contemporary world need to be acknowledged and considered. They are all contingent products of history. The relationship between the sciences and the humanities changes over time. Their relative capacity to threaten received wisdom has varied immensely through history. The awesome costs of laboratory sciences, as we know them now, are largely a post-war phenomenon. The perilous state of the humanities now, the financial state of the humanities, has been a decade in the making, and it will get worse with further program closures over the next few years. The ongoing current assault against research in the humanities aims to limit the possibility that the humanities will expose not only the imperfect character of our political and economic systems and the hollow character of the work many people are locked into for most of their lives, but also the unjustified and unwarranted character of our understanding of and convictions about human nature. Of course, on those occasions when science and the humanities joined forces, all such matters can be placed on the table for consideration. But experimental science on its own does not guarantee that those questions will be addressed. Because the sciences and the humanities often do not collaborate effectively, in fact, science's potential to challenge cultural assumptions sometimes remains unrealized. Human genome research, for example, has long eliminated any real basis for believing that popular conceptions of race have any basis in biological reality. Yet, I believe it's fair to say that millions of Americans still cling to the cultural construction of the biological fiction of racial difference. Eliminating the psychological and ideological belief in racial difference would have major social benefits, but the goal is still out of reach, in part because that collaboration between the sciences and the humanities on this subject has not really fully taken place. What's more, current science publishing practices in universities, which maximize the institutional rewards for multiple articles of, shall we say, minimal originality or import, regularly bracket the epistemological implications of scientific research. But even if scientists were pressing epistemological doubt, few in the political or commercial worlds would be willing to abandon the profit potential in scientific research that would vanish if science were cast back into the dark ages. Despite what I think needs to be remembered as the counter evidence of profitability apparent in the humanities-based entertainment industry, from books to films to TV to music lyrics, many purported stakeholders seem willing to do just that with the humanities, to cast it back into the dark ages. In any case, there is really no widespread conviction that science as a whole needs to be reined in and housebroken. There is every reason to suppose that is exactly what some corporate, cultural, and political forces seek to do to the humanities. In the light of this ongoing assault, can we prevent the humanities from being housebroken? Can we preserve the academic freedom to celebrate diverse and idiosyncratic cultural achievements and to draw provocative comparisons and contrasts across the whole of human knowledge? Can we maintain the capacity to challenge received beliefs, the confidence in righteous nationhood, and our blindness to injustice and prejudice? Can we sustain the humanities' necessary resistance to increasingly instrumental models of the educational mission? The main structural support for all these endeavors has been the tenure system. Tenure does not guarantee, to be sure, that all humanities faculty would be courageous in their teaching, writing, and institutional participation. You may have noticed that. But it does help protect those who are. Unfortunately, the massive reliance on contingent faculty continues to grow. It's largely eroded the tenure system at some institutions and eliminated from much community college teaching. The consequence that college teaching is being deprofessionalized and that contingent faculty just don't have any academic freedom or any real role in shared governance needs to be much more widely and deeply understood by all of us. But if I had to select one characteristic anecdote to prove my point, it would be this. And I interview contingent faculty all across the country. I've been doing so for nearly 30 years. Part-time faculty members have repeatedly told me in different places in the country that they decided not to assign a particular book because they were afraid their students or their parents might be offended and they would lose their job. And people have talked to me and said, I was going to assign this, and I chickened out, and I didn't. I compromised and assigned something else instead. I think it's fair to say that most of us who've had tenure have never entertained such a thought throughout our careers. Indeed, we often have the privilege to choose books exactly because they will get our students upset. The inexorable rise in the percentage of contingent faculty nationally now has a new component. I talked about this earlier today. I wanted to emphasize it again. A move is afoot in Louisiana to offer tenured humanities faculty members a choice in the presence of downsizing. Lose your job based on budgetary excuses or accept a part-time position at less than half the salary. Those who agree to take the offer of an annual or semester-by-semester contract will then be considered to have voluntarily given up tenure and its employment security and guarantees of academic freedom, and the AEUP is very worried that this practice is going to spread. At the same time, the defense of academic freedom does offer a rallying point and a common interest for all the cohorts of faculty. If humanists are losing both faculty lines and their infrastructural support, and thus the ability to exercise their academic freedom, if they take your job away from you, by the way, your academic freedom is kind of diminished. It doesn't have much practical reality at that point. You know, it's like, belief in God. You can hold it, but it doesn't necessarily affect your life. If humanists are losing their academic freedom that way, scientists are losing their academic freedom in quite a different way. The traditional pressure on scientists to obtain grants became something quite different when funding began to shift from peer-reviewed government grants to corporate contracts. The pressure to produce marketable products suddenly trumped a scientist's right to pursue the research he or she would choose to do. And that's fundamental to academic freedom. You're interested in this, this is your passion, you follow it. Too often now, scientists, especially those on the tenure track, are told, don't do that, You can bring in more money if you do this. This is what we want you to do. That pressure to opt for the project that will bring in the most cash, almost always now an individual corporate contract, or more terrifyingly still, what are called SCIs, or strategic corporate initiatives, they end up binding whole groups of faculty to the corporate wheel. Both of those phenomena are increasing. And the AUP at the moment is in the midst of studying the ways that multi-year strategic corporate initiatives bind faculty financially to the wishes of the corporation. After the Gulf oil spill, it was real simple. The standard government recommendation is that when you're funded by a corporation, your research is embargoed for 30 to 60 days while the corporation decides whether there's patentable results that they should have responsibility for. BP was issuing contracts that embargoed research for 3 years. As I like to put it at the time, the average sea turtle in an oil slick needed results before 3 years were up. It's only a matter of time before scientists in this kind of situation realize they are actually working for a corporation, not a university. They have a university title, they have an office somewhere in a building, but they are not really employed by a university. They are really employed by a corporation, and it's to a corporation that they owe everything. They are thus typically not doing the jobs they were trained for. They're not living the lives they thought they were choosing when they opted to become faculty members. They thought, as scientists, they were choosing self-determination and the ability to direct their lives by their own intellectual interests and passions, and they are increasingly losing it. So I think there are grounds for a kind of solidarity over academic freedom that are going to be increasing, and that will increase what scientists' interest in collective bargaining, because they need to be protected. It's only a matter of time before it dawns on them that they need solidarity and collective action as well. Yet, at this point at least, scientists are less vulnerable to having whole departments and programs closed. The public appreciates the more dramatic benefits of medical research, of engineering breakthroughs, and so forth. We, meanwhile, have few products to celebrate. And indeed, many humanists are ill-prepared to defend their broader aims and have failed to communicate the changing nature of their fields to the public. The truth is that the failure to acquaint the public gradually with the transformed epistemologies of the humanities means they're really not going to like what they hear if we go out on the road now. For we have learned that the eternal verities are not so reliable. We have learned that the past is always in flux, that far from simply preserving a venerable history, the humanities are of necessity dedicated to reconstructing it. The process will never end. We have learned that texts cannot speak with a unitary or transhistorical voice, that they are inherently, unstably plural and self-contradictory. The 20th century, meanwhile, which pivots on the Holocaust and Hiroshima, demonstrated that human nature, which some of us claim to believe in and to know its identity, can embrace any sort of organized violence, any imaginable evil, that there are no transcendent values. Transcendence is itself a product of history. It is created in time, and it's time-bound, nothing more. This is not what the public, by and large, wants to hear. But I believe that rather than suppress such perspectives, we must assert them with greater force and clarity than we have before. We must be who we are and stop apologizing for it, and stop claiming that the humanities deserve support because it would be mean not to give us support, or because we deserve a piece of the pie, or because we can introduce our students to banal truisms. These are not persuasive arguments, and we can't settle for them anymore. This is partly what I tried to do briefly in my September 2nd piece about the fierce humanities in the Chronicle of Higher Education that was distributed for you. I didn't plead for tolerance. I didn't ask for funding. I didn't manufacture weak arguments about the social benefits of communicating humanistic values, since I don't believe that they exist except through struggle. Instead, I describe a Holocaust poetry course that I teach in terms of the burdens that it places on my students. The one purpose of the course is to help all of us confront the infinite human capacity for evil, and in the process to evaluate literature's capacity, specifically poetry's capacity, to bear witness to it. Of course, as we all know, Anne Frank is famously applauded for asserting in her diary that people are basically good, but she did not have the opportunity to reaffirm her faith after Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Holocaust poetry demonstrates that human beings are not basically anything, that they await culture, family, society, institutions, and indeed accident to be shaped into what they are. All physically possible actions and behaviors, all arguments capable of articulation, fall within the parameters of the human. Nothing is guaranteed, nothing is prohibited, nothing is too monstrous to wear a human face. Again, no apologies, no easy bromides. The seminar relentlessly shows how the music of literary witness is undone by the historical facts it confronts. This places a burden of pain on my students. It makes it less easy for them to live their lives. It complicates their self-understanding and their understanding of others. I would hope it will haunt their years as they go forward. So much for the humanities as entertainment. The notion that all values are contingent, that all perception is mediated, doesn't mean that there is nothing outside linguisticality, as is often claimed. Rather, it means you cannot access it outside language and the semiotics of meaning. Relativism doesn't equal nihilism, but it does mean that values are never more than a terrain of advocacy, struggle, and a record of historical behavior. That's all we have. That's the terrain on which we can fight for what we choose. The public, however, once again, is not massing at the gates of the campus to hear these things. Already demonized in the culture wars, our internal postmodern version of Origin of the Species is not ready for prime time. Certainly not for a public that increasingly believes education is little more than job training, and indeed a president who seems to believe the same thing. But we must nonetheless take the risk and find compelling and accessible ways of communicating what I'm calling the humanities at their most fierce to both the campus and the public. Doing it, by the way, will make it clear, for example, that job training is often a death sentence. Job training can mean an income for the rest of your life, or for a while, doing something that you in fact hate to do. The humanities and social sciences, on the other hand, if they're gutsy enough, can help students understand what work is, what it takes from you, what it can cost you in freedom and self-realization. Far too many people, by the millions, become trapped by family and property into unfulfilling occupations. We should not send students out into the world thoroughly deceived about what their futures will be. That's nothing much to be proud of. The humanities and social sciences are burdened with transmitting that unwelcome wake-up call. None of this, to be sure, is testable. Human beings are, fill in the blank, capable of infinite evil, creatures that celebrate their birthdays once a year, bearers of the best that's been thought and said, fill in the blanks, whatever. That's not what this is about. I don't ask my Holocaust poetry students to take multiple choice tests about the capacity for human evil. I do not suggest we devise multiple choice tests about the dehumanizing character of much industrial and corporate labor. I do not suggest we evaluate students' understanding of what it means to struggle for values in a world in which no values are guaranteed. The accountability and assessment movement, on the other hand, which has largely overtaken K-12 education, now has its eyes on higher education. And as I've said before, it has a wedge issue, the education of K-12 teachers. Case law gives the state a vested interest in the education of elementary and high school students, and thus state and educational and regional and national accrediting agencies will seek more power over and uniformity, specifically in teacher training programs. Look for more prescribed syllabi, more identical final exams, more fixed choices, more universal syllabi, less academic freedom, less opportunity for variation in educational philosophy. Indeed, no space for educational philosophy at all. In the current economic climate, almost anything that we ask for humanities disciplines is likely to be heard and dismissed as special pleading. Certainly on the eve of what I expect to be the emerging campus budgetary wars between disciplines, that will be the likely result of arguing for funding within the university. The process of allocating existing resources is already becoming more brutal, more self-interested, and indeed more preordained than it has been at any point in our lifetimes. So I would urge us instead to embark on an educational project. Assert what we believe and do our best to explain it. Let our example be our defense. We need a humanities offensive, not a humanities defense. Part of what we must do, however, is also initiate a multidisciplinary conversation about the mission of the university. The task of reaching consensus about higher education's goals and purposes across the divergent ideologies of the disciplines is going to be extraordinarily difficult, especially at large multiversities where the faculty has stopped talking, let alone negotiating across the divides separating professional schools, sciences, and the humanities. But we can't make a public case for higher education effectively without some consensual definition of our mission. So in addition to in a humanities offensive, we need a process of self-examination that tries to reach a partial, truce about the overall purposes of higher education, at least within our institution. What are those overall purposes? What special responsibilities does higher education have in a democracy? What are the key elements of our university mission? If it turns out that we can agree on a collection of purposes, among them preparing students to be well-informed participants in a democracy, if that's at least one goal we can all support, then I think pretty much the whole range of existing disciplines have something that they can contribute to that wider aim of preparing students to be democratic citizens. And perhaps then we might realize that suppressing those purportedly less profitable disciplines, even though the strongest of them in the humanities actually bring in substantial tuition dollars rather than corporate contracts in many institutions, and tuition dollars and corporate contracts, the stack of dollar bills actually doesn't look very different when you put them on the table. They, in fact, then contribute to the common good. And perhaps then we all need to be willing to bankroll poetry. The task of saving the humanities is itself the heart and soul of the larger project of saving higher education, and it does need saving. The last few months should have made that clear to everyone. No one predicted that 2010 to 12 would be the years of humanities program closures at SUNY, Albany, and elsewhere. The AAUP gets a letter of complaint about a department closure at least once a week. I'm not sure you've been hearing about them at that rate, but that's the rate our national office gets a request that we help intervene with a department that's been closed. While press hostility to tenure has been on the rise for several years, we weren't expecting legislative assaults on tenure in Florida, starting with K-12 and now moving up to the next level of higher education. Although some candidates for state office included attacks on public employee collective bargaining in their 2010 stump speeches, we weren't expecting an organized, multi-state legislative campaign against collective bargaining to sweep the country, reaching critical stage in Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, and of course in Florida, and in progress in Michigan. The Ohio initiative to apply yeshiva language to public university faculty declaring them to be managers not eligible to organize, I think took everyone by surprise, especially because when the Supreme Court made that decision in 1980, everyone thought it was ludicrous to say that we were managers. But if any of us still feel like managers in 2011, I haven't met any. Meanwhile, except for the reactionary think tanks planning the maneuver, I doubt if any of us anticipated the recent Wisconsin and Michigan raids on faculty emails that we considered private and that my own university today considered regulating, according to an article that I prompted Inside Higher Education to write. And I haven't been back to check my email yet tonight to see what decision the Faculty Senate made. But the Faculty Senate Executive Committee already recommended that the Senate adopt this policy restricting faculty email use substantially, and I co-authored a letter with FIRE saying that the restrictions that the Faculty Senate Executive Committee had proposed were substantial violations of the First Amendment rights in the Constitution. Maybe that will have reached them as an issue, the Constitution, that is. I thought it was just Texas that was going to secede, but apparently Illinois is planning to as well. Of course, speaking of Texas, I don't think any of us imagined the thoroughly grotesque Texas effort to quantify and assign dollar values to faculty productivity on an individual basis. In terms of this thoughtless protocol, I'm no doubt in the red economically, having, I trust, been there politically for some years. I spend many worthless hours meeting with graduate students and working on publications every month, and I don't bring in any grant money. Finally, the assaults on university labor centers, a target for many years, have intensified in the last year. And widespread antagonism toward public employee pensions is still building. I don't think there's going to be a single state in the country that doesn't indulge itself in antagonism toward public employee pensions. It's coming everywhere. In 1915, in its famous declaration, among the other things the AEUP asserted is that we must preserve the faculty right to challenge our students. That's not what the forces aligned today against us want. Some want to reduce access to higher education so as to preserve an exploited underclass that can contribute to the wealth of a few. Others want higher education itself, and the humanities in particular, defanged and commodified for exactly the same reasons. We have no political party supporting a more complex and unsettling view of educational aims. There is no difference between the National Democratic and the Republican Party on this matter. They think education is job training. They don't think they should pay for it. They're all speaking from the same place. So we, happy few, must create a new constituency for academic freedom. We didn't seek that task, but it's ours. We preferred our classrooms and our studies, but that's not going to suffice. History has given us this challenge. This is the time and place in which we live. This task, this cause has fallen to current generations of faculty and students. Some of us have lived out our lives without any reason for solidarity, but that can no longer be said of this generation. We have a mission to preserve and improve the institutions we've built. They are threatened. We are called to a cause, and we have cause to call others to an accounting, our opponents. The curse of living in interesting times has always had its compensations. At least we do not have to ask what work there is to do. Thanks. Sure. So if you want to ask questions of Sandra Day O'Connor, we'll send them to her. We can't get any answers right now, but.